Okay, we are going to get Grand Rounds started today as people are coming in. Thank you for attending this Grand Rounds. We have a couple of announcements to make before we start our talk today. The first announcement that we have is please join me in congratulating Dr. Renee Henn on being elected to the National Academy of Medicine. Election to the Academy is considered one of the highest honors in the field of health and medicine and recognizes individuals who have demonstrated outstanding professional achievement and commitment to service. On a personal note, Renee was my PhD mentor and I could not be more proud of him. So congratulations to Dr. Renee Henn again. For next week for Grand Rounds, we have Dr. John Pachenkis, the Susan Dwight Bliss Associate Professor of Public Health at the Yale School of Public Health. His talk is titled LGBTQ Affirmative Mental Health Care, From Theory to Trials to Community Implementation and Global Dissemination. As a reminder for today, we will prioritize questions from trainees during the discussion session after today's talk. We encourage everyone to pose questions at any time during the talk using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom window, which is separate from the chat. If you are a trainee, please put the word trainee at the beginning of your question. For today's Grand Rounds, I would like to welcome Dr. Daphna Shohamy. Dr. Shohamy is a professor here at Columbia University. She received a BA from Tel Aviv University and then went on to receive a PhD from Rutgers University in the laboratory of Dr. Mark Gluck. Notably for her PhD, she was given the Dean's Dissertation Award for the best dissertation at Rutgers University. For her postdoctoral research, Daphna spent 3 years in the psychology department at Stanford University. And then in 2007, she joined the faculty at Columbia University and has been here ever since. Her research is focused on the intersection between learning, memory, and decision-making. She is interested in questions such as how are decisions shaped by past experience, when are decisions guided by explicit knowledge, and when by implicitly learned associations or biases. Her laboratory performs behavioral and neuroimaging studies in healthy individuals and in patients with isolated damage to specific brain systems. She has been honored with numerous awards, including the NSF Career Development Award, the McKnight Foundation Memory and Cognitive Disorders Award, and a NARSAD Young Investigator Award. She has received several grants, including grants from the NIMH, NSF, Dana Foundation, and NINDS. She has over 80 publications, and her work has been featured on CNN and WNYC, as well as in the New York Times and Time Magazine. She currently teaches undergraduate and graduate classes at Columbia University and has many collaborations with international labs at the Zuckerman Institute downtown, and even here in the psychiatry department. The title of her talk today is How Memory Guides Value-Based Decisions. Please again, join me in giving Daphna a warm welcome. And Daphna, thank you for being here and you can take it away.
Thank you so much, Christine. I'm delighted to be here. Being on Zoom, but it's not that far away, and I have many friends and collaborators amongst your community, and so it's really particularly exciting to be sharing my work. And let me join in the congratulations to Dr. Henn on that wonderful achievement. For today, I'm sort of debating I sort of had this first impulse to want to share all the collaborative work, and then I thought, actually, maybe this is a great opportunity to step back and share kind of the bread and butter, the fundamentals of what my lab focuses on in terms of just basic mechanisms of memory and memory-guided decision-making, and kind of showcase some of the work we're doing, particularly in healthy individuals, and share that with you, and kind of keep in the background some of the collaborative work that I've been doing with some of you, the most substantial one being with Joanna Steinglass and Tim Walsh, looking at decision-making related to foods in eating disorders. So let me just get started and share my screen here. It's amazing. It's almost like 2 years into the pandemic, and somehow still feels nerve-wracking to see if everything will share properly. Oops. Which of course it isn't. Okay, so I'm just going to assume that you can see and hear me, and if anything changes, someone will let me know. So, we all spend a lot of time, perhaps now more than ever, wondering about the decisions we make. And I think a really kind of fundamental challenge in both health and disease is to try to understand how do we learn from experience to make good decisions, the ones that sort of increase our health and optimize our behavior. This is a question that neuroscience, systems neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience is really focused on extensively in the last decade or so. And it's an area of an enormous amount of growth and discovery. And to summarize a lot of work in kind of one slide to start us off, most of that work has converged on the discovery that a key brain region important for learning how to make good decisions is the striatum. Of course, it's part of the kind of main input structure of the basal ganglia. There's been a lot of work both in single cell recordings, in studies of patients with Parkinson's disease who have disrupted striatal function, pharmacological studies in humans, and a great deal of computational work supporting all of that, as well as work with fMRI in humans. And there's been a really kind of elegant, cohesive story emerging from all these different approaches. And in brief, one can summarize that story as teaching us that the striatum plays a fundamental role in learning the average value of candidate cues or actions. That this learning is incremental in the sense that it takes place over many trials or many experiences. Let's get my computer closer here. And the conclusion from a great deal of work is really that what we should be thinking about in terms of the system is that it's kind of a neural substrate for learning habits, that it's kind of this opportunity for the brain to learn based on outcomes which cues or actions are the ones that are more likely to lead to reward. And so the fundamental idea is that through this learning mechanism and through a history of reward, we can choose actions and cues that are more likely to lead to reward in the future. And I think this has, again, been an exciting area of discovery, but as somebody who's coming to some extent from kind of more of a psychological cognitive approach and interested in kind of decisions we make every day and that we kind of really sweat over, one problem is that most decisions don't really work that way, right? We don't always have an opportunity to sort of create a habit or learn incrementally. So here's just one example you've all made recently. Should you attend the talk this week? You might have had a chance to attend Grand Rounds talks, 20, 30, 100, 200 times, and you might have learned kind of an average value associated with that choice. But some of you might have attended a talk at Grand Rounds once before, and you can still make a decision based on that experience without having developed any sort of cognitive habit. And moreover, I'd say that even those of you who have been to many Grand Rounds talks before, in addition or in parallel to learning the average value of a talk in Grand Rounds in general, you have specific representations and memories of the different talks you've been to, which ones you've enjoyed, which ones you've learned from, which ones maybe less so, which ones maybe you missed. So we have all this kind of nuanced knowledge about individual events in addition to or separate from any kind of general average value. And so clearly we have this knowledge in a way that relates to memory. And one of the questions we got really interested in is how does that work? So how do we access different aspects of memory representations in a way that guides the decisions we make, and how does that interact with these kind of more habitual, incrementally learned representations? So the working framework that we focused on in the last several years in my lab is really to sort of ask ourselves, in parallel or in interaction with this striatal habit learning system, Where else in the brain is there a candidate region or structure that is well suited for forming representations of a specific sample, even if it only happened once, of rich episodes, being able to kind of recall back what happened at the last talk you went to or a talk you went to 2 years ago. And in particular, I think what we need here is sort of some kind of system that has flexible access to this kind of information because we want to be able to reason about memories from the past, and we want to be able to make inferences about past events and how they relate to a new situation that is changing all the time. And so it'll be no surprise to most of you that we've focused on the hippocampus in this regard. And the kind of parallel focus on the striatum and the hippocampus has deep roots in cognitive and systems neuroscience, going back to the idea from Larry Swire and Brenda Milner and Sue Porkin of kind of separate memory systems. And the way we've been thinking about this is not so much as separate memory systems, but that the hippocampus is really well positioned to provide information or input to the striatum and the basal ganglia frontal lobes more broadly about these other kinds of memories. And although I'm not going to go into it today, another kind of point of departure from our perspective on this relative to earlier theories of the organization of memory systems in the brain is that I think we now have a lot of evidence suggesting that the hippocampus plays this role in ways that can be explicit but are often implicit. So above and beyond the ability to consciously recall a specific memory, that there's kind of this influence, a pervasive and perhaps continuous influence of memories and of hippocampal inputs into decision-making all the time. So just to kind of get us all on the same page, what are we talking about when we talk about the hippocampus, given that there's so many kind of divergent points of emphasis on this structure? So just to remind everyone, of course, the hippocampus came into focus as the kind of structure fundamental to forming episodic memories, detailed memories of individual events. More recently, in the last 10 years or so, there's been a lot of work on the important role of the hippocampus in prediction and prospection, not just recalling events in the past, but actually being able to envision in detail possible events in the future, and in that sense, playing an important role in planning. And of course, place cells in the hippocampus highlighted the role of the hippocampus somewhat in a separate literature in navigation and kind of spatial cognition. And I think, the biggest influence on our own work has been an attempt to bridge these different perspectives on the hippocampus, an attempt that was theorized and developed by Neil Cohen and Howard Eichenbaum. And Cohen and Eichenbaum proposed that we can understand the role of the hippocampus across these different kinds of behaviors by thinking of the hippocampus as binding elements of an experience across time and space, something they refer to as relational memory. And I think one of the compelling aspects of this relational memory perspective is not just that it unites these different ideas and different literatures about hippocampal function, but also that it really gives a new way of thinking about the role of the hippocampus in decision-making and planning more generally. So that's had a heavy impact, heavy influence on our own work. So really, to summarize what we're kind of trying to do, the goals have been to gain insight into how different forms of learning shape the decisions we make, and to characterize circuit-level interactions between the striatum and the hippocampus and the relation to specific kinds of behaviors where we can follow kind of behavioral markers to understand the role of these structures in decision-making. The approach in my lab to addressing these questions is first to develop kind of a different kind of behavioral task in some sense. So we're interested in behavioral tasks that often draw from animal conditioning theory and paradigms, where we're not asking people to report necessarily what they know or don't know. We're asking people, as you'll see in the tasks I'll show, we're asking people to make very simple choices, but where the task is structured so that we can then go back and understand something about why people made the choices they made without having to ask them. And that confers two advantages. One is it has really helped us step away from this idea of conscious awareness as central to hippocampal function. And it has also kind of opened up much more possibility for collaboration and testing parallel hypotheses across species. We also use fMRI in mostly healthy humans, which is an incredibly useful tool for us for looking at parallel and interactive activity in multiple brain regions as they relate to specific aspects of behavior. And finally, a really core aspect of all the work in the lab from the very beginning has been also in parallel to do work with patients with kind of two rationales. One being that fMRI is excellent at providing us whole brain activity related to a behavior, but can't really tell us anything about the causal role of any one particular region. So we've been looking at patients, for example, with specific hippocampal damage or patients with striatal disruption to try to test hypotheses about the contribution of one part of the brain versus another. We've also been using patients to some extent as a model to test more specific hypotheses about dopaminergic modulation of behavior. I'm not going to go a whole lot into some of the work we've been doing on dopaminergic modulation today, but you'll see it's sort of a central theme of everything happening in the lab. And finally, to the extent that we can understand something about parallel contributions of multiple brain systems, I think this offers opportunities for thinking about compensation or resilience with relevance to patients' quality of life potentially. So I'm going to talk about 3 lines of research in the lab today. The first question we're going to focus on is this question of episodes and how can we understand something about how memory for one particular event is shaping the way people make decisions, and is there a role for the hippocampus in that process? Then I'm going to talk a little bit about some studies we've been doing trying to get at this idea of flexibility and of using learned information from past experience in a flexible way to make inferences or generalizations when we're making decisions in a situation that's changed. And then finally, I'm going to talk about some work trying to understand more the nature of the process of deliberation and the potential role of memory in kind of deliberating between choice options, helping us to resolve the deliberation towards a choice. So one of the core questions we've been trying to understand is how are decisions guided by one-shot episodes? On one hand, it's kind of obvious that that happens, and anecdotally we all can understand that that's something that's fundamental to our experience, but there's actually been very little work addressing the question of how that takes place. And the challenge has been how to experimentally track which memory is being used for a given decision. Right, so we take a rat and train it to press left or right, and train it that if it presses left, it usually gets a reward. We can understand something how, on average, it's learning the possible reward associated with pressing left. But we really still don't know, even in this kind of simple setup, on a given trial when a rat is pressing that left lever, what is it actually using to make that decision? What is the nature of the representation, and where is that information coming from? It could be that it's thinking, oh, 3 times ago I pressed left and that worked. Let me try that. Right. So the challenge here is to sort of quantify that possibility. And so what we've been doing is designing tasks that start with a typical average learning task. I'll show you in a moment, repeated choices, fluctuating average value, and then to add trial unique episodes that can give us a handle on quantifying different influences on behavior. And so I'm going to show you one example of this sort of line of research. The one I'm going to show you is a task developed in collaboration with a former postdoc, Catherine Duncan, and former grad student, Raphael Garrity, and in collaboration with a long-standing colleague, and we've been collaborating with, I guess, about maybe 15 years or so, Nathaniel Daw, who's at Princeton. So here's the task we designed. To explain it, I kind of want to make sure you really get the details because there's key aspects of how the task is structured that enable us to kind of make the kind of inferences I'm going to share with you. So at first pass, imagine you're a participant in the lab, and your job here is to choose between a red square and a blue square. And let's say you chose red and you won 75 cents, which is good here because here you can win anywhere between 0 cents and $1. And so you see red and blue again, and we have you do this over and over again, and maybe you choose red again, and this time maybe you win 65 cents and not 75 cents. So the overall structure of this kind of task, which is similar to many other tasks others have used before, is that we vary the likelihood or the magnitude of reward, here it's shown on the y-axis. Let me see if I can get my cursor. There we go. So in this case, we share we vary the likelihood of reward on the y-axis across trials here on the x-axis. And I just want to point out that in this case and in many other cases, what we do is we make sure that the relationship between a choice and the outcome varies probabilistically over time. And the main objective of that is to basically make sure that people constantly have to update their choices based on their past rewards, and so that allows us to track that process itself. And so to note, in this particular version, we have these reversals spread out throughout. Behavior on these sort of tasks, the way I've just described them is very well fit by reinforcement learning models, by simple kind of model-free or Skorla-Wagner type of models that show that people generally are pretty good at tracking the likelihood of reward as it changes over time. But we're interested in another question about this, which is to what extent are people actually using that average value? And so we added one particular detail to the task here, which is that in addition to choosing between the red square and the blue square, which I'm going to refer to now as we do in a task as kind of cards, in addition, we sort of overlay objects or images of objects on your choice. So nothing has changed about the task structure or the relationship between red and blue and reward. The only thing that's changed is that on each trial, you also see these objects. And we structure the presentation of the objects such that, generally speaking, they only appear once. So there's sort of these trial unique episodes. But then every once in a while, an object you chose before might appear again. It will never appear more than twice in the entire task. But what this allows us to do is to take advantage of this reversal structure to ask if you chose red before in a phase here when red was the winning color, and now we present you with the opportunity to choose that same object again, but at a phase when blue is the better card, what will you do? And so this allows us to pit the choice as emerging from memory for that object that was a high value object last time you chose it, versus going with your knowledge about the average value of the deck, which in this case is going to be higher if you actually go with blue. And so we structure the task so that you have this deck that appears on every trial, again, which we're sort of using as a proxy for your ability to learn the average value, and representation of and memory for this object, which appeared only once before and at most twice when you have a chance to kind of choose it again, which we're referring to as kind of an episodic influence on choices. These two are not correlated in the test, so we structure the task carefully, that there's no correlation between these two forms of knowledge. And this allows us to measure whether one-shot episodes influence choices, and if so, what are the neural substrates. So the first thing I'm going to show you is sort of the simplest possible way to quantify this. On the x-axis, we're looking at trials since reversal, and on the y-axis, the probability that participants will choose the luckier deck between the red and the blue. And so this is now just ignoring those objects and just looking at the average value. And not surprisingly, people are really good at learning this. As they move away from the reversals, they get better and better at choosing the luckier deck. We can now show a similar kind of analysis for just the episode. So now what we're looking at is the value of that object if last time you saw it, ranging from 0 cents to $1, and the likelihood that you'll choose that object if you see it again. And so again, perhaps not surprisingly, behaviorally, we're seeing that people are tracking the value of these objects, and they're more likely to choose them if they were of a high value when they saw them last time, and less likely to choose them if they were of a low value last time they saw them. So this suggests that at the level of sort of simple quantification of behavior, decisions are guided by both averages and episodes. Here I just want to show the model fits. This is sort of using a standard reinforcement learning model, showing the fit of the model to behaviorally participants. And here's just a very simple modification of that model, just adding an episodic component. This here, a lower number is a better fit, so we're finding better fits of these models. Again, really not surprising, just sort of reflecting what we see in the raw behavior. So in this test, participants really don't have to use episodes or this kind of one-shot information, but they do. And that allows us to ask questions about the neural mechanisms of this kind of decision-making. So we're asking really, how are decisions guided by averages or episodes? And I want to give you a flavor of how we're doing this analysis. I mean, if we sort of look at the actual choices a person makes, right, they're only choosing between one object or another, the one on the left or the one on the right. And so the actual output in terms of behavior, and this is an example from a particular subject, is binary. They chose the blue or they chose the red, and that's all we really have. But what we want is to estimate the likelihood that the choice was episodic as opposed to going on the average value of the blue or the red. And so what we do is we generate, use each participant's history of trials and rewards to generate that estimate. And specifically what we're doing is we look at the behavior and basically take into account, was a participant in a phase of a task where red was winning or blue was winning? Did they choose in accordance with that average value? And if not, did they choose in accordance with the episodic value? And we sort of put all those factors together to calculate the likelihood that any one choice was episodic. So here, for example, in this participant, here's a phase of the task where red was winning. They suddenly chose blue. When we sort of input that person's particular history of trials and rewards, we see that the simple model calculates that this is estimating this as high likelihood that this trial was episodic. And what's useful about this is now we take these binary outcomes from the task itself and we generate this continuous regressor of likelihood of episodic choice. And that allows us to use this regressor now in our fMRI analyses. So now we can use these subject-specific and trial-specific estimates of episodic choice and ask where in the brain is there bold activity that correlates particularly with this quantity. And what I'm showing you here is the result of that analysis. So we're asking where in the brain are there voxels where bold activity correlates with the regressor of a choice being, the likelihood of a choice being episodic. And you can see, we see activity in a number of regions of the brain, including these more posterior visual regions, as well as significant activity across the length of the hippocampus. And this suggests that choices that are guided by a single past event are associated with bold activity in the hippocampus. But one thing we want to understand as people interested in kind of how value is learned and how it's used is not just what's happening at that time of retrieval when people are making a choice, but what was happening in the brain when people were learning the value to begin with. So we can use this exact same estimate of episodic likelihood and look back at the previous trial when they were presented with those objects and ask a question about value learning. Where were there voxels in the brain corresponding to the response to the outcome or reward when people saw that object the first time for those trials where they later make this episodic choice? And so we can use this kind of approach to backsort the data and look at bold activity at the time of value learning. And we see that there's significant activity here bilaterally in the putamen that is predictive to some extent of this hippocampal activity at choice time later on. So it suggests that encoding of episodic value is associated with bold activity in the striatum and related to the later use of these hippocampal representations. So far, these data suggest that memory for single episodes guides decisions in a dynamic reward learning task. That the hippocampus and the striatum work together to support learning and reward-based decisions. I don't have time to go into it, but given that the audience or presumed audience here, I just wanted to share that some work by former graduate student Juliette Davidow, who's now a professor at Northeastern University, who's interested in adolescence, that her work has shown that hippocampal contributions to learning are even greater in adolescence. And former grad student Kendall Brown became really interested in the question of how reward modulates what we learn and showed that reward retroactively enhances episodic memory for incidental cues. So it's not just the thing that's valuable that's enhanced by reward, but also the things that were predictive of that valuable thing. Even cues that were neutral at the time, if they played a temporally or spatially predictive role in predicting later reward, they are also better remembered. So I'm going to turn to the next phase and just share a quote I really love to share as a brief break here from the science. This is a quote from the book The Giver, speaking of adolescence. It's sort of a young adult book that my daughter recommended to me when she was in 6th grade. And it's a science fiction book, or really a kind of dystopian book. It talks about this dystopian society where people basically don't have agency and don't have choice. Everything's dictated, so in some sense everything's a habit. There's no deliberation. People are given families and jobs, and life is incredibly well structured, and there's no variability and no uncertainty. And one member of this society is an older member of the society whose job it has been to keep in mind all the memories of society before it became this dystopian reality. And the book describes, for those of you who haven't read it, and many people have, it describes the relationship between the holder of the memories, the giver, whose job now is to transfer those memories to a young man who's now been assigned to that same job, to take over the memories of life before it was the way they knew it. It's really a beautiful kind of contemplation of what memory is and what it's about, and I think very much about how it drives our behavior. And there's one quote in particular I'd like to share. This process of receiving the memories from the giver is painful and difficult. And at some point, this young man asks the older man, why do we do this? Why do we even hold on to these memories? And the older man says, I occasionally am asked to use these memories to advise the elders of our society when they're making decisions. And the young man asks, do you advise them often? And the older man replies, rarely, only when they are faced with something that they have not experienced before. And I really appreciated this quote when I ran into it kind of coincidentally while reading this book at my daughter's suggestion, because I think it really makes explicit this idea that memory is most important not when we encounter the things we've encountered before, even though it sometimes feels that that's what memory is about. But the memory is especially important when things are changing and uncertain and fluctuating. And I think that raises a really big question and challenge for those of us trying to understand how memory guides behavior, because it really raises how we can understand how if you need memory to apply to the same situation, that would be one kind of challenge, but understanding how memory can guide decisions when the situation changes requires different kind of sets of constraints and computations and mechanisms. So the question this brings us to is, how does memory guide decisions in new situations? And one idea that we've been really interested in is memory, in addition to providing us a trace of a particular one event that happened in the past, that perhaps the more fundamental role of memory is that it actually allows us to knit together or integrate past events. And that allows us to build a generalizable model, a model that's flexible and goes beyond any one episode, that makes predictions about what may happen in the future. We and others have suggested that the hippocampus likely plays a really important role in this process. I want to kind of give you a flavor for how several of us are thinking about the mechanism, and then show you some data supporting that. So the basic idea is that you're going through your life and you encounter two stimuli in parallel. I'm just going to call them here stimulus 1 and stimulus 2. There's been extensive work showing that the hippocampus kind of binds together the representation of S1 and S2 based on their co-occurrence in time or space, or both, and creates this kind of associative link between them. And this is really the kind of cartoon version of the essential idea underlying this relational encoding theory. What emerges from that is this interesting situation where, let's say you now encounter S2 without S1, but S2 is now in an environment where it's associated with reward. You now encode this new association of S2 and reward, but upon encountering the S2, your hippocampus contributes to a process of pattern completion and kind of retrieves the associated memory from before of S1. And I can think of this, as many have referred to it, as sort of a process of reactivation of a memory trace based on a pre-existing mnemonic association. And what this reactivation creates is an opportunity now for potential integration of S1 and the reward. So they're both associating with S2 in mind, and this can enable this process of integration where now S1 can kind of become indirectly associated with reward. So one question is, does this happen in the human brain? This is something we and others have shown some evidence for in the past, but the really big question here is whether it happens in this particular way. And so our approach to addressing this kind of question has been to use tasks that measure spontaneous integration without requiring or rewarding it. So there's a typo on that slide. I should say without, not with. Requiring or rewarding it, and is using tasks that are inspired by animal conditioning to kind of, as you'll see, allow us to learn something about the structure of knowledge underlying behavior. I think really the best example of some of the work we've done is a little while now ago. This is with Elliot Wimmer, who's also been continuing this line of work in other really elegant tools and developments. In our hands, what we did is we basically took this really basic structure where we, like I showed you before, we take two stimuli, S1 and S2, and we pair them temporally. I'll show you in a moment. Then we take those S2 cues and we pair them with reward. We take other S2 cues where that are not associated with reward. And then basically we ask people to make a decision between S1 plus images. Okay, I'll show you the exact kind of idea what this feels like for an experiment, someone who's in the experiment in a moment. But the idea is that between these two S1s, neither one was directly paired with reward. So you should have no preference between them unless you're using what you know about S2 to derive your choices about S1, because this S1 associated with this S2 was indirectly associated with reward, and this one was not. This task, by the way, for those of you using animal conditioning or interested in it historically, this is a variant of the sensory preconditioning task that's also been used recently by Jeff Schoenbaum to try to get at this idea of sort of structured or model-based representations. But this goes back to 1939 and was developed by Bogdan. So how we test this in humans, we basically use these visual images. We show people images that are paired temporally, S1, S2. And there are a series of these kind of S1, S2 pairings where we control for the familiarity of the images and the likability and so forth. So it looks something like this. You're going through the task. You're supposed to detect a black and white image. But in the background, there's sort of these temporal regularities showing this temporal pairing between S1s and S2s so that you learn the association between them. And then what we do is we have a really simple kind of reward conditioning type of task where now you see the S2 cues associated with reward while other S2 cues are not. And finally, then you have a decision phase. And in the decision phase, we have essentially a sanity check or control condition. We ask people to choose between the S2s that were rewarded and the S2s that were not. And we don't expect people to have any problem with that. And then we also ask people to choose between the S1 images that they saw, the ones that were associated with an S2 associated with reward, or the ones that were associated with an S2 that was not associated with reward. And so that looks something like this. We don't give people any feedback in that phase, and we tell them we'll give them the kind of reward they win later on. And so the way we're thinking about this has to do with this, what I alluded to earlier, this idea that there's reactivation during the reward phase that allows for this flexible behavior. And so our hypothesized mechanism is that when you're learning the association between this cue and the reward, you're reactivating the S1 cues, and that is what is allowing you to show any preference, if you do, for the S1 plus images. And so Elliot had a really great idea for how to test this mechanism. We had shown earlier that a lot of the bold activity in the hippocampus here is predictive in general of this behavior, but we hadn't been able to get at the specific mechanism. Elliot followed up on that work with this idea. So the first question we asked is, where in the brain does activation during the reward phase predict later behavior? And the second question is really when, which phase? And then finally, really the critical question is there any evidence for reactivation? So the simple analysis one can do is just to ask whether bold activity during the reward learning, the simple decision conditioning phase, is it predictive of later behavior? And we see that it is, and this is replication in itself of previous results showing bold activity in the hippocampus being predictive of later flexible behavior. But to get at the evidence for reactivation, Elliot suggested, why don't we take advantage of the fact that specific areas of visual cortex are active when a person sees or imagines categories of cues, right? So we all know that when we're looking or thinking about body parts or faces or outdoor scenes, we show specific activation in areas of visual cortex. And this, of course, has been shown very nicely for faces by Nancy Kanwisher, but since then has been followed up that we get this sort of nice selectivity and bold activity. And we also know from memory work that it's not just when you're perceiving these images, but also when you're thinking about them or remembering them. And so in reality, in this test, for those S1 images, we use these body parts and faces to try to see whether we could quantify activity related to body parts and faces and scenes during the reward learning phase when those particular images are not presented at all. So again, we're sort of relying on the association between S1 and S2 here and asking if there's activity here, if there's any evidence for reactivation here that's predictive of later behavior, we should be able to detect that, and we know where to look specifically in visual cortex because we know the category that this particular image was associated with. And so that was the logic behind the analysis. I'm going to show you the result. What we did basically is we took each person and defined their voxels in an individual person that were most responsive to actual presentation of body images, face images, or scene images. And then we can probe those particular voxels later in that reward learning phase and ask, is there any difference in the bold signal in these visual category regions for trials that resulted in these integrated or flexible decisions versus trials where they were not. So these are when people tended to choose S1 plus, and this is when they didn't. And what we find is a significant difference here in activity related to those S1 stimuli, suggesting there's some kind of reactivation of those images even when those images aren't being presented, and that it's predictive of later behavior. Finally, we were interested in knowing where else in the brain is there activity at the time of reward that might be correlated with activity in the hippocampus in a way that's predictive of behavior. So we performed a functional connectivity analysis. In this case, I'm going to show you data from a PPI analysis, where basically we asked, we take those hippocampal regions that were most active during the reward learning phase and use them as a seed and ask where else in the brain are there voxels that are showing correlated time course of activity with those voxels, but in a way that's behaviorally sensitive. So we're looking for a region that shows more correlation with the hippocampal time course for decisions that show this marker of flexibility compared to when people don't show that behavior. And we found activity in bilateral regions, again, of putamen in the striatum, showing this correlated activity or functional connectivity with the hippocampus in a way that's behaviorally specific, suggesting that interactions between the hippocampus and the striatum predict use of integrated memories. So this suggests that exploring the role of the hippocampus in integrating memories addresses an important challenge in decision-making, using past experience to inform decisions we haven't directly experienced before. Just to mention, we think that dopamine plays an important role in this process, and that's also something that Jeff Schoenbaum has shown in animal work. We've shown in humans with Parkinson's disease on and off medication that model-based decisions of this sort depend on dopamine using a slightly different task. And in collaboration with Nathaniel Daw and Oliver Wickblad, we've also shown that hippocampal contributions to this kind of model-based planning that has to do with sort of an understanding of associative structure and spatial memory are different or altered in people with unilateral hippocampal damage. So in the last few minutes, I want to share kind of different problem, but related problem we've been interested in. One that I think to many, to my mind at least, sort of tests the limits of memory in a more demanding way. So in the tasks I've showed you until now, they're all tasks where we're really kind of planting the memories, we're seeding the memories, and we're asking people to use them or making it useful for us to track when they're using them. And in the next phase, I'll be asking a different question, which is really, even when we don't really need memory, to what extent are we using memory if it provides some useful help in resolving indecision? And so the problem this line of research is focused on is one of, for me, exemplified well by a decision between a Kit Kat and M&Ms. And this seems like a really simple choice. It might be for many of you, but for me, this is a difficult decision, not because I don't like Kit Kats or M&Ms, but because I like them equally. So when we know from an enormous amount of research in behavioral economics and psychology that when people have to choose between two things they like equally, that becomes a very difficult decision and one that takes people longer. In collaboration with Mike Shadlin here at the Zuckerman Institute and Akram Bakor, a joint postdoc, we became interested in why these difficult decisions take more time. What is that time going for? And we hypothesized that it may be related to memory, that it may be that what's happening is that we use memory mechanisms, such as retrieval or prospection, to consider each option and to generate the evidence. So I'm going to show you a couple of results from this collaboration, and also including Ariel Zilberberg, who is a postdoc with Mike Shadlin, who did some really interesting follow-up work that I won't have time to go into today about value updating in the hippocampus. And the main hypothesis we were interested in was this idea that for decisions based on internal evidence, right, there's nothing in the M&Ms or the KitKat externally that tells you what to choose, that in those situations, the hippocampus may supply the evidence, and that this may work analogously to how perceptual decisions are made along the lines of random dot motion, which of course Mike Shadlin is well known for understanding at the neuronal level. And the idea is that more difficult decisions require more evidence and therefore more time. So the task we designed was, first we asked people to make a series of these value-based decisions between snack items. And then to control for decisions in general and input in general, really to kind of be able to hone in on this idea of internal evidence, the same participants also perform this perceptual task where they have to determine whether there are more yellow dots or more blue dots on the screen. And we compared reaction time for food choices, controlling for reaction time and decisions in general. So first, I'm just going to show you some behavioral data. The critical thing to pay attention here to was on the x-axis and plotting the value difference. So 0 here is the indifference point. Between the two options on the screen, we have reports from participants in advance about how much they value each each snack item based on this kind of auction procedure. And on the left, on the y-axis, I'm showing you here on the top the proportion of choosing one of the items, and on the bottom, the reaction time. And so we see what we'd expect to see. People are more likely to choose things they value highly, less likely to choose things they value poorly. And this is the reaction time data replicating what many other people have shown before, that people are slowest and really most variable both in behavior and in reaction time at this point of indifference. And the black lines here are the fits of a drift diffusion model, which I'm not going to go into, but it really is just a model that kind of is well suited for capturing questions about evidence accumulation in decision making. On the right now, I'm showing you the same data for the perceptual decisions. So again, as many people have shown before, likelihood of choosing shows accuracy, and then the reaction time shows this typical slowing. So it takes more time to decide between options that are closer in value, and we wanted to understand why. So to get at this question of decision time in the hippocampus, what we did is first, we were interested in the time itself. So we compared the reaction time regressors between the task about snacks based on internal preferences versus the reaction time regressors for the decisions based on blue or yellow external input. So we can generate a regressor that makes that comparison and cross it with the fMRI data. And then the second question we're interested in has to do with memory, is to ask whether that additional time is related in any way to memory processes. And so we can use a conjunction analysis with a regressor for memory retrieval that here we test separately, and I don't have time to explain exactly how we did that, but feel free to ask me about that. So we did this analysis that's looking at the reaction time regressor, contrasting between the two conditions in conjunction with a regressor that's looking at areas that are specifically related to memory retrieval. And when we do this analysis, we see activity in the hippocampus, more on the left than on the right, but if you use the threshold, we see this bilaterally as well. And this suggests that memory-related regions are more active with longer reaction times, especially for value-based decisions. I'm going to skip over this. I realize I'm not quite sure when the end time is. So I'm going to skip over the functional connectivity analysis, or at least this explanation, since I kind of already went through the logic, just to say here again, in this very different task in a very different setting, we see this connectivity, functional connectivity, or kind of correlation in the time series between the hippocampus and putamen as it relates to decision time. One of the key questions that should be on your mind right now is, well, wait, did HM have a problem choosing between snacks or what to have for lunch? And it's not something we read about in the textbooks. And if we think the hippocampus is playing an important role in the decision time for these kinds of simple decisions that don't really require memory per se, we'd expect people with damage to the hippocampus to have that kind of deficit. And so we decided to kind of put this theory against this very difficult prediction to some extent, and collaborated with Mika Rufai and Daniela Palumbo to ask individuals with hippocampal damage and kind of typical amnesia to perform this task. And so I'm skipping over the details of the participants right now. I just want to show you the behavioral data. So in blue are the controls. These are controls matched to a task that the amnesics did here. We see the exact same pattern of behavior as before. We make sure that the amnesics can all recognize the snacks and they know what they are. And here I'm showing you the behavioral performance for the amnesics, showing that when you look at the perceptual task, they perform just like healthy controls, as we'd expect them to. If anything, they're even a little faster at the perceptual task. But when we look at this value-based task, we actually see a really striking difference in the timing here, and a small difference in the accuracy. So a couple of interesting things to note here. First, they're a little bit less accurate, but this small difference in accuracy doesn't explain statistically the difference in reaction time. So they're slow at these value-based decisions, but not the perceptual decisions. They're not just slower, they're also flatter, suggesting that they're less sensitive to the difference, that the reaction time is less sensitive to the difference in value than healthy controls are. So these data suggest that hippocampal damage selectively impairs value-based decisions, but not perceptual decisions. These are just the individual data because it's a very small sample, but you can really see this pattern in each of the patients with amnesia. So far, suggested data suggests that difficult decisions take more time and involve hippocampal memory mechanisms. We think this could be related to deliberation and construction of value, and there's been a recent really nice kind of follow-up by my student, Natalie Biederman, who's showing that memories that are formed during deliberation actually tie together the things you're deliberating between in a way that later drives counterfactual thinking and regret, and the key to that process, value updating, is how well you remember the association to begin with. So to tie that all together, I'm showing you today that across 3 very different kinds of behaviors that all involve a simple choice. We only ever present people with 2 options on the screen and they just have to choose between them. That in all of these cases, that decision involves the hippocampus in different ways, and that the hippocampal involvement isn't just showing up as kind of a bold activity, but that it's related to specific aspects of behaviors that we can quantify and interacts with regions of the striatum. So to conclude, there's a pervasive role for the hippocampus in guiding decisions that depend on internal evidence. The hippocampus and the striatum work together to guide memory-based decisions, even in situations that don't, at first glance, seem to really require any kind of memory retrieval or judgment at all. Some think that there are all kinds of implications for policy and economics. Some of the work with Catherine Duncan showed that people use memory differently to make decisions if they're in a familiar context or a novel context, for example. We've been very interested in the implications for education and what some of these mechanisms mean for curiosity and exploration. And then, of course, in collaboration with some of you, we've been exploring the implications for health-related behavior and for mental illness, specifically for eating disorders, anxiety, and depression. So with that, I'll end by thanking the wonderful people I've had the pleasure and continue to have the pleasure of working with, and our funding sources, and thank you for sitting through yet another webinar, and hopefully we can all actually have real talk sometime in the near future. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Daphna. We're having some technical difficulties today, so you can mute and then we can get perfect. Daphna had some feedback, so Thank you so much for that. Just fantastic talk. And it's just really elegant work. And I think we all really appreciated you coming up here today in person, but not in person really, to give us that talk. So we have a number of questions that attendees sent in. I guess I would like to start with a simple question of, you presented the data on the hippocampus, but have you discerned between any subregions of the hippocampus in your findings, and can you speak about that?
Yeah, it's a Right. Thank you. That's a great question. We pay attention to it in standard resolution as much as we can, and we find, interestingly, that many of the value-related signals, maybe not surprisingly, are associated with bold activity in the more ventral regions of the hippocampus in humans. We haven't done detailed enough analysis of the specific subregions, and of course we're well positioned to do so, and it's something we've thought a lot about and just really haven't gotten to on the list of things to do. So I don't have anything super useful to say about that at the moment, and it might be especially interesting to look at those kind of pattern completion type of processes as they relate to the hippocampal subregions. And I think now, in many ways, for us now is the time to start doing that. We never wanted to kind of sacrifice the whole brain coverage, but I think now we've done it a number of times, and it's a good moment to kind of dig into that.
So I will start with a question from Jeff Miller. Jeff thanks you for a great talk, and he would like to know, have you or others used the memory tasks you presented in patients with PTSD? What has been found, or what would you anticipate in this population?
It's a really good question. We haven't done that. One thing we've become interested in, part of a collaboration with Blair, was to look specifically at this generalization process of the kind we can capture in the sensory preconditioning task in anxiety. And we found some interesting asymmetries between the generalization of reward versus loss. I didn't go into this at all, but you can imagine we do this on the same task where you're rewarded for a good choice, or instead of reward versus no reward, we can also add loss. One of the things we've noticed in a lot of piloting is that when you do that, you see much more, in healthy people, much more variability related to the loss domain than the gain domain. And it's something we've really struggled to understand and don't have a good explanation of at the moment. We haven't done all the experiments one would want to do to dig into that, because we've mostly stayed in the reward domain. But it's something that stayed in my mind, and something that emerged in this collaboration with Blair, where we were looking at social anxiety in this kind of task with rewards and losses, and seeing this asymmetry. Haven't done it with PTSD, and I think that would be a really interesting possibility. And this is where if we were here, so let's get coffee and talk about what the right task would be, because I think this is something that's come up a lot with Joanna Steinglass, is the importance of the domain we're exploring. I'd be interested to think with you together, Jeff, about kind of what would be the right outcome to make this task best suited to looking at generalization of loss versus reward in PTSD.
Great, thank you so much. There are 3 questions, and you briefly touched upon this, but I'm going to group them all together from John Mann and Chris Anaker and Miriam. They would like to know, do you find differences in bold activity between the anterior versus posterior hippocampus in predicting flexible behavior, considering the different roles of the anterior versus posterior hippocampus in encoding values per se?
Yeah, so it's, I don't know if everybody after the pandemic is feeling like I just can't wait to catch up, but these questions are like, yes, that's what we want to do, that's what we want to do. And so it's just making me feel like, wait, why is it taking it so long? It's a great question. So we've dabbled in it. We've looked at it anecdotally in the data we have. We haven't done a formal comparison, even though it's not, of course, that complicated to do. What's interesting is that when we're specific, where we often see the value-related signals per se, like just related to high versus low value outcomes, in the more anterior portions. This region that's more predictive of generalization, this kind of generalization behavior, we see more posteriorly. And so one question we're really interested in, and I think would be a great project, is just to go back and really quantify that comparison directly, which we haven't done. We really did, this was also the first time we did sort of like whole brain analyses, you know, corrected for all the multiple comparisons and so forth. I think we could really do a targeted search there, which we haven't done yet.
I think clearly many people in that based on the questions. Chris Anaker also had a question. Decision-making is commonly associated with prefrontal regions. Which prefrontal regions do you think are involved in these perceptual value-based decisions, and do they receive hippocampal?
Yeah, great question. So the area we've looked at the most, and you know, I always feel like I need to apologize for not having included enough prefrontal cortical data in the talk, but maybe next time. But the area we focus on the most, not surprisingly given the literature, is ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And so we often see corresponding signals between ventromedial prefrontal cortex and hippocampus as sort of part of a network for, we think of as, you know, others as well, as the construction of value. And this is important, I suppose it's worth noting in that sense. Some people have thought of ventromedial prefrontal cortex and its role in value, sort of different ideas around. Our perspective is very much aligned with this idea that there's it's sort of part of a network for construction of value on the fly, as opposed to having like a currency matrix, you know, in ventromedial prefrontal cortex that pre-exists. So for example, in a study with Mike Shadlin and Akram Bakor and Ariel Zoberberg, I didn't tell you about this work at all, but what we can do there is look at value the way people assigned it when they started, before they basically did the task, or value the way we would predict it might change based on the memory retrieval in the task. And so we can look at initial value and our prediction of updated value. And for example, we see that bold activity in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex is more tightly correlated with a predicted value, the changing value, than the original value, which we think speaks both to the fact that this updating occurs, but also to this idea of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex as being responsive to changes in value, as opposed to having that kind of pre-existing value representation. So that's the main region we focused on.
Thank you. We have a question from Richard Brockman. He would like to thank you for a fascinating talk and has a question of, are more persistent or stubborn decisions more likely to be based in the striatum, and can they only get overruled when the hippocampus is more active?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think basically there's really something to that, this idea of different levels of updating. And there's a really nice study many years ago now by my former postdoc, Brad Dahl, which he's with his former graduate advisor, Michael Frank, where, I don't know if you know the study, but they looked basically at a kind of form of confirmation bias. They used one of these simple probabilistic tasks where the likelihood of, you know, winning for blue or red changes over time, but they gave people advanced information. They said, you know, let me tell you blue's the better one, or let me tell you red is the better one, and that information could be accurate or inaccurate. And they asked questions about how people update and when they update and who updates. And so and it was a really kind of nice way to capture experimentally this idea of stubbornness of decisions and needing to update them. They didn't look in the hippocampus per se, but they looked at prefrontal cortex and areas that I think are really probably interacting with the hippocampus for the use of that kind of information. So I think that's probably exactly right. And something we've been interested in these other tasks, similar to the first one I presented with episodic memory, is really the question of not just do people use episodic memory, but when are they more likely to use it? And we have some evidence that people are more likely to be influenced by those early episodes than later episodes, which I think speaks also to this idea of kind of you rely on not just on different kinds of information based on what you know about value, but also based on how relevant they are to other forms of information at moments in time.
Richard would like you to give the reference again to that work, if possible, if you know it off the top of your head.
Yes, it's Dahl and Frank. I can't remember if there's another author, and I can't remember the journal now, but around 2010. You can email me and I can send it to you. But if you look up the work that Brad Dahl and Michael Frank did together, they did a few different studies on this kind of prefrontal striatal trade-off in learning based on outcomes versus sticking to pre-existing information.
Okay, we have a question from Guillermo Horga. Guillermo writes, you mentioned the role of the hippocampus in flexible learning. Within midbrain striatal systems, there is also a gradient of flexible versus stable or habit-related value representations, the latter of which predominate in dorsal striatum, including the putamen. I was a bit surprised to see that some of the fMRI results you showed in the one-shot learning experiment pointed to the putamen. What are your thoughts on the mapping of striatal gradients and contributions of hippocampal dependent learning?
I think it's a great question. We were also a little bit surprised. I think we don't really know yet. I think it's one of those sub-region questions we're in a good position to answer now because we finally know which behaviors we can use to track these different approaches and associate them with bold activity in different regions. So, one of the things we're most interested in that I didn't show you data for because we're still working on it, it has to do really with the balance between the two, right? I kind of showed you can do this, you can do, really in many ways, what we know so far is just what happens when you're using that episodic approach. But it's not an either or, and in many ways, I think the question you're asking, both in terms of the kind of anatomical breakdown, would be best answered when we can understand how people are kind of trading off or titrating between them and how they're merged, right? In many ways, I think a lot of the interesting questions are right in that gray area, and that can help us start getting at this idea of different striatal subregions as they're related to these behaviors. But for now, we don't have any data about that in our own tasks.
We next have a question from Mike Schmidt. He would like to ask, since the episodic component of the red-blue deck task is designed to have no actual predictive value, would it be fair to say you may be studying superstition? It is not surprising that people pick up on irrelevant cues and assign them value, but it is very interesting on how those meaningless cues affect decisions, and there could be tremendous value in understanding how people assign salience to these cues and how that perceived salience may or may not undergo extinction.
It's a really interesting question. In this task, we tell people, because we kind of believe in transparency, we don't want people to develop superstitious ideas, actually. So in this task, the way we ran it, we tell people, we'll also, here's what's happening. Here's the red and the blue, and you'll have to figure out which one's luckier, and that will predict reward. In addition, you'll see these objects, and occasionally you'll see them again. And if you do see them again, nothing's changed about them. So we make them irrelevant for reward prediction, but we don't tell people to ignore them. In fact, we tell people, this is happening in the background. And in fact, in a different version of that task with Catherine Duncan and Elliot Wimmer, we basically told people, we showed people objects at the time of outcome that were irrelevant completely, and made it clear. And in that study, we really did show, rather than kind of working together, people actually it looked like people were sort of competing for those two kinds of information, were competing for attention rather than working synergistically. So I do think there's something to be said about the fact, it's sort of a big question, I think, that superstition in a sense is getting at of attributing causality and attributing value. And it's kind of something that's so relevant to everyday life in the sense that, and a big issue in computational models, this sort of question, something good happens to me now. The environment I'm in is so rich with cues and stimuli and relationships. How do I know what caused that, right? How do I attribute causality there? And I think that's really, in many ways, what superstition is about, but also this kind of stubbornness in the previous question. So in our task, I feel like I think we could modify it slightly to get at that question in a better way than we can now. I think right now it's not quite fair on my part to kind of take it there, just given what I know we tell participants. But it would be a useful thing to look at. And just to add to that, the other thing we look at that I share with you is we also test people's memory for the outcomes after the task. And so there's a lot of objects and people forget a lot of them. But they remember the high value ones and the particularly low value ones best, which is not in of itself surprising. But your question has given me the idea that I wonder if some people are actually showing really good memory for certain objects just because they kind of, something stood out to them. They just, they sort of attributed value there indirectly. And if so, that should be reflected in value as well.
Thank you. I really like that answer as well. So we have a question from David Hellerstein, and I'm so glad he asked this because I was going to ask another question. David wrote, in mood disorders, in patients with mood disorders, there's particular difficulty in decision-making, example, indecisiveness and ruminations. Have you looked at patients with depression to determine how their brain activation may differ from healthy subjects? And in particular, how treatments, for instance, new treatments like psychedelic drugs, might affect their brain activation?
Great questions. We haven't, and we'd love to collaborate, I think, in both directions. So if anybody's interested, let us know. I think especially this question of deliberation and reaction time, decision time, really, as it relates to how people are processing options would be especially interesting to look at in the context of depression, because we can also, I showed you these appealing snacks, or at least appealing to some of us some of the time, but people have shown similar kind of decision time, reaction time, behavior, whether you're choosing between two things you want equally or whether you're choosing between two things you don't want equally. And that might be really interesting, I think, to explore in depression. I'd love to do that.
Okay, the next question is from Tim Walsh. It's a bit of a long question, so I will go slowly. Tim said, it's a great talk. There's a very recent paper in Science about how obstetricians make the binary choice of which method of delivery to use, vaginal or C-section. What they found, and as Tim understands it, was that a complication in the most recent previous delivery influenced the choice. If there was a complication in the last one and it was a C-section, they were more inclined to go with the vaginal delivery and vice versa. The choice was not influenced by more distant past experiences and often was against standard training and recommendations. And he would love to know if you have any thoughts about this paper.
I'd love to have the reference. That's fascinating. That doesn't surprise me at all. And I think it's really so important to understand and demonstrate that these kinds of mechanisms of updating and memory, recency are going to really changing our behaviors, not just the snacks we eat, but something as important as medical decisions. So I think it's really exciting that someone did that. It reminds me, of course, of the Daniel Kahneman colonoscopy experiments that basically make a similar point, right? Which is like the way we construe a recent event changes the decisions we make about the next one. So I mean, to me, it makes perfect sense, right? It's basically, I'm sure if you asked the obstetricians if that's what they were doing, I bet they'd say no. But I think it's what our hippocampus does for us all the time. My view of the hippocampus is really sort of like a behavioral word, constantly whispering behavior so that we're not choosing in the dark. And sometimes that will be accurate and sometimes it will be misleading, like in this example. It's really interesting.
Okay, we have another question. It is saying, I'm wondering about whether posterior parietal areas previously implicated in explicit memory and familiarity are involved in the one-shot learning paradigm. If not, do you think they would be if the objects were social in nature versus non-social objects?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, we did see some connectivity with parietal regions, not in the one-shot task, though, really much more in the deliberation task. I don't know. I don't really have a well-informed answer except to say that, again, in these whole brain searches, we don't see statistically significant evidence for that. I think, there's plenty of evidence in the memory world to show, of course, you get specialization in cortical activity as a function of the nature of the cues, in addition to kind of cross-modal hippocampal activity, usually related to kind of the associative process. So I think the idea of playing around or kind of probing how different kinds of domains drive activity is a really interesting one, because it could also allow us to get more just at the networks and how they more general properties versus more specialized, but we haven't really seen that.
Okay, the next question, bear with me, it's a bunch of different messages, so I'm going to try to intertwine them. We question that is asking about a book that the attendee recently read by Derek Williams, which emphasizes how familiarity influences preferences in terms of what catches on and is diffused across the population. Do you think this is related? Do you think this book is accurate? If you haven't seen this book, the attendee says, don't worry, but they're also wondering if this is relevant to implicit racial bias as well.
It's a good question. There's a lot there. I don't know the book. I happen to believe that this is relevant to almost all aspects of human behavior. So I really think that this idea that memory is shaping our behavior all the time is something that as a society we haven't taken into account enough. And I think as memory and decision researchers, our job is really to figure out how that works so that we can understand the boundaries and so forth. But I think, yes, I think a lot of the influences of kind of hippocampal relational encoding really are implicit and change our behaviors in ways we're completely unaware of in many cases. And so I see no reason why that wouldn't extend both to kind of societal trends, but certainly also to kind of implicit biases across different groups in society. Again, we want to have data to back that up and so forth, but I think at the level of theory and concept, it seems relevant.
Okay, I have another question from me, actually. So you mentioned a paper about looking at adolescent populations, and many of us uptown are interested across the lifespan. So could you speak more about your findings in the adolescent population, and then if this changes or if you predict it would change across the lifespan?
Yeah, great. So briefly, what Juliette showed, and she's now following up on in her own lab, is that if you take one of these probabilistic tasks in the spirit of what I shared with you today, you can quantify reward prediction error signals. So how much or where is bold signal in the brain corresponding to a rewarding outcome that's surprising. You typically see this in the striatum. It's been shown many times. When you look in adolescence, what we find is that you find that signal in the striatum as expected, but also in the hippocampus, and significantly more so in the hippocampus for adolescents than adults. And related to that, we find that the adolescents also show a slightly different pattern of what they're remembering about the outcomes. So we're finding in that study that adults show more or less similar memory for surprisingly good or surprisingly bad outcomes in that task, where the good and bad are pretty mild, but that the adolescents show a slight tendency for the signal in the hippocampus, and also slightly better bias kind of towards remembering some of the more positive outcomes. That's a paper that we did a few years ago, and a lot of that is now being followed up in my lab currently with Catherine Insole, who's doing some really detailed work trying to understand these biases of memory and value on a lot of the tasks the way I shared, the ones I shared with you today, and others, where we're finding that often adolescents are just kind of more value sensitive, not surprisingly, but also that's kind of shaping what they remember and not just the choices they make. So a lot of that work is still being analyzed, and we've been waiting on being able to scan a lot of those studies, but behaviorally, that's basically what we're seeing so far.
Great. So one more question, I guess, that I have, and I apologize if you're not familiar with this work. There was a paper a couple of years ago in Nature from Alcino Silva and Denise Kai discussing that a shared neural ensemble links distinct contextual memories or ensembles encoded close in time. And so a lot of the data you showed today was, repeated exposures of those items that were close in time. Have you modified the task or looked at how does the distance between the presentations influence either the putamen or the hippocampal activity at later time points?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm familiar with that beautiful paper. It's something we've talked about doing a lot. Right now, our main constraint is, so I don't have the answer. We haven't done it. But it's something we've thought a lot about. And I think in general, this question of sort of how integration changes over time. Because really, when we think about the way we must use it, it's not a within session kind of, it's not most interesting in a within session. It's really most interesting in this idea of knitting together life's events to generate some kind of sense of knowledge. It's been a little bit difficult to come up with the right way to adapt that to humans and fMRI and to get it in a behavior that's robust enough so that we can actually test it. So we haven't focused on it a whole lot, but I think it's a really interesting question, and I hope we get to it, or someone does. I think it'd be really interesting.
So I guess I just want to end today and thank you so much. It's great to see you. I wish it were in person, but if you're ever uptown, I think we all really enjoyed just a great discussion and a great presentation today. And thank you so much again for doing this.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Any and all collaborative ideas, please send them my way. And really not that far. I'm always happy to come uptown. It's been a while. So thank you so much for inviting me.
Bye.